Welcome to the Grazing Grass Podcast, episode 28.
But utilizing goats in this type of management practice is not as common. And so it's, I'm kind of working on, it's taken more time just to work with what I have to get to where I'm going.
You're listening to the Grazing Grass Podcast, helping grass farmers learn from grass farmers. I'm Cal Hardage, your host. On today's episode, we have Leslie Svacina of Cylon Rolling Acres. She is in Wisconsin and grazing meat goats. I'm very excited to have Leslie on. It's been a few episodes since we had a producer focusing so much on meat goats on the podcast. In fact, as I quickly think back, I think Ben Hobbig was on an early episode, and he was mainly focused on meat goats. Leslie, we want to welcome you to the Grazing Grass Podcast. We're excited to have a goat producer on here today.
Thanks for having me, Cal.
Leslie, can you tell us about yourself and your operation?
Sure. My name is Leslie Svacina, and I own and operate Cylon Rolling Acres. We're a grass-based livestock farm in western Wisconsin. So our farm is about an hour east of the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, and I raise meat goats on pasture. We have about 140 acres on our farm. About 20 of it is in permanent pasture and about 20 acres in hay ground. And then the rest of it is, we have in woods or other farm, stead areas. So we've, our goats we raise a herd of Boer Kiko cross meat goats, and our herd is about somewhere between 40 to 50 head of breeding animals right now. And I know you mentioned you have raised goats in the past. Yes. And so our herd, while that's our breeding size herd, at a high during the year, we could be up to, anywhere between like 120 to 150 head of animals. Since we're still I'm still growing my herd. We are raising some feeder market goats along with our herd, just because most of our doe kids we're keeping to replacement stock for our herd. I probably get into it a little bit more, but we've been doing a lot of management of our herd to continue to build a hardy herd that performs well on pasture, and then of course the other characteristics you want in your livestock, and particularly goats too. So that's been kind of an ongoing process of growing our herd. But on our acreage, we graze our permanent pasture, but we've also been starting to graze in our woods and work on renovating our woods. Has a lot of overgrown oak savanna, so working on trying to convert that over to utilize it for and managed grazing with silvopasture. And then we also then direct market all of our goat meat direct to consumer, and also work with local retailers for wholesale accounts. And our wholesale accounts are within about an hour of our farm. Most of them are in the Twin Cities, the metro area that's in our area, but there's a number of accounts that we have even just in our own backyard here in rural Wisconsin. Our direct-to-market consumer business has expanded to where we have offer on-farm pickup for order, but also ship across the country as well. And a little bit on our farm, I've been raising goats for about 8 years. We bought our farm almost 10 years ago. And the last, I'd say 5 years, we really had a focus on direct marketing. Before that was kind of getting the feel of grazing goats, getting the infrastructure set up, and so forth. And early on, we worked with NRCS to get our grazing plan set up and really get our infrastructure set up. Our farm was a retired dairy farm. Given that we're in Wisconsin, that's probably no surprise. And then eventually it was beef. Our pastures were overgrown from CRP set aside. But we definitely were in need of new fencing, so we had updated our fencing. I knew one thing with my little bit of research on goats before we got into it, that fencing was very important. And so we wanted to make sure that we were all set up to continue to move our farm forward in the future. So that's a little bit about where we're at with the farm operation, kind of at a high level.
Very good. Very interesting too. Now let's jump back. You said you got goats about 8 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Did you have experience with goats before that, or other agricultural experience?
No to the goats. People always ask that if I had a pet goat growing up or a 4-H project, and I didn't. I didn't grow up on a farm, but when I was in high school, I grew up in a rural area in northeastern Wisconsin. And so through being involved in FFA and agriculture education, I kind of found my way into agriculture. Growing up and studied agriculture in college. I worked in the egg business side of things after I graduated college in the Twin Cities, working in communications and marketing. But then my husband grew up on a dairy farm about an hour north of where we live. And my family has a small business, owns a small family business. And so the whole idea of owning my own business, whether, this happens to be a farm, it doesn't surprise me now that I look back. But I think I was going to get into goats. No, but when we started looking at buying land, my husband wanted some land for recreational purposes, and then we're like, well, maybe we should put it to use, as well. And then, of course, you never can have that much land, and what started with maybe 20, the 40 acres is now 140. But that, has become to grow more just because of the interest in farming. But the reason we've focused in on goats is I started to look at market opportunity, and one of my friends is a high school teacher in a community north of us, and she had recommended they have a large Somalian population in their community. And she's like, you should really take a look at raising meat goats. And she had mentioned the growing trend with the diversity in our, not just in our backyard, but also, in general with our population across the United States. And a lot of folks from a variety of cultural backgrounds, have grown up eating goat meat, or maybe it's a special occasion, a special dish, and dietary preferences change, and which has led to an increased demand for this protein. And then as I kind of dug into it a little bit further, realized that goat meat is actually, there's not much infrastructure out there when you think of go-to-market strategy as you do with beef or even lamb, poultry, other proteins. And so realized that there was some market opportunity there, given that it's really hard to find in the grocery store. And if you do find it, typically it's imported from Australia. And so it's, those two pieces kind of married together of finding market opportunity. And then as we looked at the farm itself, I knew I'd be managing it all on my own, and managing small ruminants for probably 95% of what I do. I can manage a lot of it on my own. I don't mind having the extra help if I have it, for my kids or my husband. Yes. But I knew that, kind of pairing that market opportunity and something I could manage on my own, from a physical standpoint was kind of fit the bill as we kind of looked at opportunity for the farm. So then as I kind of got into goats, I started to learn more about grazing through some of the small business, agribusiness, and women in agriculture networks I'm a part of. And then it just seemed like, well, that makes sense. This should be a part of what we're doing in the future for how we manage our land and also raise our animals.
So you highlighted some very important points there with goat meat. The U.S. imports way more goat meat than what we can even produce. The consumption's just crazy for goat meat. Not so much in my area, but like you mentioned, food trends are changing, and then we have the diversity coming in. But goat meat is becoming something that more people's aware of. I've eaten goat meat more in the last 10 years of my life than I did in the first 30 years of my life. So it is changing. Now, when you decided, you looked into this, you saw the opportunity, you thought, hey, goats work for me, I can do it. Then you looked at your farm. What did you have to do to get it ready for goats?
Yeah, so our farm, we were fortunate when we purchased it. There were several outbuildings that we could use for, especially in winter when we think about Wisconsin. We don't have the opportunity to graze year round. You can try hard, but we have we have a couple of barns that we needed to do a little bit of work on, but one we use as our main goat barn, and our second dairy barn we were able to use for hay storage and some overflow pens. But to really get it set up, we had to put up new fencing. The existing fencing was grown into the tree line, and I don't know, it probably had been years since there actually had been cattle on the land. So we had to put in infrastructure for fencing. We put in seasonal water line for having water for grazing, also some animal walkways. And so those were the really key pieces for getting the farm set up. We did some of it ourselves, but with goat fencing, it's pretty expensive, and I wanted to make sure it was done right. So that was one thing that we, bit the bullet and had a professional come in and do it for us. But I'm glad we did that, because I think anybody that I ever meet that said that they had, oh, you have goats, and then their first story is about how they had a goat and it got out and jumped on somebody's vehicle, or some bad story, story that gives goats a bad name. So, that was the biggest thing for us, is really getting that fencing infrastructure set up. We were fortunate with the barn to be able to have a facility to house our goats before we were able to graze them. But really, once we had that perimeter fence up, then we were really set to go. Especially for that first season of grazing.
And what's your perimeter fence look like?
We have a high strand tensile wire on the top that's hot, and then woven wire, and then barbed on the bottom. So part of that is to keep the goats in, but we have 3 guardian dogs, so we want to keep them in as well, from jumping over or crawling under, and then of course to keep predators out as well. We have plenty of options for predators, so that fencing is also one of the other important reasons why we wanted to invest in good fencing too.
Okay, so on the woven wire, do you get your goat's head stuck in it?
Yes. So it's kind of the give and take of having woven wire. So where we run into issues is when they're kind of in their teenage years, so when they're yearlings and their horns are just starting to come in. Once they get older, either their horns, especially now that we have more Kiko in our herd, they have a hard time getting their heads through. The ones that have more boar horns, which are more kind of smooth and straight back, tend to learn the right technique to get in and out. But yeah, we have 2 of them right now that are continuously getting stuck. But eventually they will outgrow that. So, it's for the little bit of time that it happens, it's kind of aggravating, but it's better. I look at it, it's better than having goats get out I've got to, hunt them down, or have the sheriff's department calling me, or upset neighbor.
Oh, I agree. Now, on our woven wire, we put up goat woven wire that's got the stays, I think 12 inches apart. So most of the time they can get their head out without a problem. I say most of the time, almost always, because they're able to turn their head to the side. And I'm sorry you're listening to this on podcast, because I'm doing it with my face. But you turn it, and then they bring their chin down, and they're able to get out. Sadly, I have some cattle panels, and like you said, those teenagers, those yearlings will get their head stuck in those cattle panels without fail. So I'm always excited for them to outgrow that stage.
Oh yes, I can identify with that.
Now, one other thing you mentioned was the barn aspect, and I know you're working in much colder temperature or climate. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. But here, when it rains, the cattle's out there, they're fine. The sheep, they don't care. The goats, if there is one drop of rain falls from the sky, they're running to the barn. They don't like the rain. So having barns there, has that been your experience with your goats?
I would say yes, to an extent, for that I let them have access to the barn. So once we start grazing, they don't have access to the barn. So we only use it during kidding season and over winter. Oh, yes. So once we're out on pasture, we have some pasture shelters that we have that are kind of like little huts, or they're repurposed calf hutches, like group calf hutches. And they're strictly more just for some shade or rain cover. For rain cover. But my goats don't like being wet, but I've been impressed now that we've been grazing, how on days in the summertime, when, especially early spring, when we have a lot more rain, that they'll still go out and graze in the rain. They may not always like it, but I think they're hardier than they like to let on.
Oh, very good.
But they definitely, don't do well with the rain. So we've tried to set up our grazing system to accommodate for them to an extent, which has included some shelter.
Right, yes. My goats were not fans of rain. Now, one of the first farms I got my original stock from, they had some tanks cut in half, and then they put gates on front of it so only the kids could go in the tanks for shelter. They wanted their doe. They didn't want their does running inside at all.
That's an interesting idea.
Yeah, I assume it worked good because they had a fairly large herd and was doing really well with it. Now, as we talk about rain, let's talk about what kind of climate you're in there. For those people not familiar with Wisconsin, tell us a little bit about your climate.
Sure. So for Wisconsin, I'll kind of talk about it in kind of terms of like how when our seasons kind of come and go. So, we're cold. We're colder, but in the springtime, our spring will tend to start sometime around April to May. It kind of depends on when Mother Nature wants to let us out of her grips. But we'll typically, hopefully by May we're starting the grazing season and our grass is at a good height to get started. You typically see quite a bit of rain and moisture, probably until about the end of July, and then things start to slow down. We still will get rainfall, but it kind of starts to taper off at that point, or it's a little more intermittent. And then typically we will have a pretty good grazing season up until probably about the end of October, and then we kind of see what we can get from there. So winter sometimes can onset, I say October. Typically, if I can get graze until December 1st, I'm really happy. But that kind of depends on when we get snow and when the cold weather sets in. So this year we actually had snow like mid-October. So we had to pull up fences, and it gets tough for how we can manage our subdivided paddocks, especially with the goats when we're not working just with stepping posts and one strand of wire, so just kind of gets a little more complicated that way. But yeah, so then in the winter time, kind of around December time, we'll usually end up getting snow, but our weather can really then start to make a drop to single digits. It's not uncommon to be below zero. Sometimes we've had stretches 25 below zero, so we have to really look at how we adapt our goats to kind of hardy up for winter as well. But then also that means we have to kind of take that into consideration for winter feeding. We try as much as we can to stockpile our pasture just to extend our grazing season, but really at some point it's hard to extend it into the really cold months and with the snow as well.
Right, yeah.
So hopefully that helps with
it does.
The description of our weather, so, and our seasonality.
It does. You do get a fair amount of snow, so that limits how long your stockpile is going to last. And you have a fairly lengthy cold season, at least relative to myself in Oklahoma. And a lot more snow. We get a little bit, but not a great amount. Now, when you talked about rainfall, about how much do you get each year?
We're about 33 inches of rain.
Oh, okay. It's something I'm always curious about. And it's especially important with small ruminants, because as we think about the amount of rainfall, we've got to consider parasite, how we're handling those internal parasites on goats and sheep. And
definitely
goats.
When we are in our more rainy season, or we have or it's rainier, we definitely are looking at like where we have our goats on pasture. There's some areas where we have dry runs where water will flow through there seasonally, or when it's rainier in June, where there's more standing water. And so we really want to try to we avoid those areas where we move through there a lot quicker. We also have added more portable fencing that I feel comfortable using outside of our perimeter fence. We'll continue to also utilize other areas on our farm for grazing that we maybe haven't had in the past, so we can either let some of those either avoid some of those areas or hold off on some of those wet areas to graze a little bit later in the season, to kind of work with parasites as well.
Oh, yes. Very good. What kind of forages do you have in your area?
Yeah, so the forages, so when we started working on getting our our pastures established, we focused on letting the goats help us renovate the pastures to start with, which was a great advice. Now looking back, I'm like, of course, that makes sense. But it was great advice from our grazing specialist with NRCS at the time. And so since then, we did one first round of grazing there, and then we started to let the existing seed bed start to come back into play. And so most of our pastures had been, as I mentioned before, in old like CRP set aside, and so they had been they're overgrown. There's still some trees still growing in there and other brush. It's changed a lot over time just simply with grazing, but we've done a little bit of planting as well. But what we typically we see in our pasture, which are pretty diverse, is a mix of alfalfa. We've got different clovers: red, white, sweet clover, orchard grass, timothy, brome, ryegrass. And we've also done some addition of some other forages that, I guess forbs is probably the better terminology, that are trying to look for ways that I can add more plants or more species that are targeted towards goats. So we've added chicory and bird's foot trefoil and plantain as well. I'm always kind of looking at what can I add for diversity, because I found that the diversity really helps our pastures thrive throughout the year. We still have a lot more to do to continue to, especially extend that grazing.
Oh, yes.
Help with having a higher quality, especially in August. But diversity has really been key.
Oh, yes. Yes. It does help out greatly. When you added those grasses, did you drill them in or did you broadcast? How did you get those additional species there?
Sure. So how we've taken a number of different approaches to seed our pastures, and so we've kind of focused on different areas where either we've needed to put more attention on it, and kind of done it in different stages, just so we could continue to utilize our pastures versus not putting too much pressure on them. Early on, some of our areas were very bumpy from, I don't know what they are, like moles or woodchucks or something. And so we've done some areas, more tillage than maybe we probably would, doing down the road. But we've done a little bit of light disking, and we have a small little planter where we would then direct seed the seed in. And when we did that disking, we just did it lightly, just to rough it up, just to allow for the seeds to get in there, but still try to maintain some of the existing plant life that's there. So that we've taken that approach. We've also, one season we were going to rent a no-till drill from our local Fish and Wildlife office, but because I wanted to plant bird's foot trefoil, they consider that an invasive species, so we had to go to a plan B, which is fine. But I wanted bird's foot trefoil, so I wasn't going to not plant that. So that year we decided to just try a modified approach with our little grain drill that we have. We have a little 5-foot grain drill, and so we just set the drill settings to the lowest possible that we could, and just tried to take an approach of trying to make it work like a no-till drill, even though it's not a no-till drill. And it actually seemed, we were hoping that it would work well, but we planted white clover and the bird's foot trefoil, and we did see the clover come up. Bird's foot trefoil we didn't quite start to see established for another couple of years, but that kind of takes time. So I'd say it worked out okay, considering that we were trying to take a modified approach with the resources we had. But then last year we rented a real no-till drill from one of my friends who has one at a neighboring farm, and so we used that to do some work to also enhance our pastures and our hay ground. Yes. And then this year we've also done a little bit of winter or frost seeding, like hand broadcasting. So I did a little bit of that this season. We did quite a bit more of bale grazing without hay feeders this year, because I wanted to put more emphasis on building our one pasture that we usually outwinter our goats in, and for feeding, just because the quality of the pasture hasn't been as strong with the plant species and so forth. And so we have more hay residue out there, which is good for a lot of other reasons, but I also thought it probably would be a good conduit for helping germinate our seeds as spring comes along too. So yeah, we've done different seeding approaches, but we've tried probably quite a few options.
Oh yes, very good. Let's jump over to your goats for just a little bit. You mentioned you have boar Kiko
Sure.
crosses. Is that what you have always had?
Mm-hmm. We started with just boar goats, and if for folks who are listening, they're not familiar with goats, boar are kind of I like to compare them to like the Angus of the meat breed world. Of course, people might, or of the meat goat world, but of course, some people may argue that maybe there's better breeds in the beef world too. But they're pretty well known for their body composition for being a meat animal, and so that was important for us. Is important to me, especially when we look at like marketability for our animals in the long run. As we continue to grow our herd and implement our grazing practices, we also learned that we needed to have that. I guess not all goats are cut out for grazing and being working animals. Doesn't mean that they're not, they don't have purpose other places or can work in other management, other styles of farming management, but we still have lines that are from our original foundational herd. But as we continue to work in grazing, we learned that parasite management is really important, not only just in how you manage your pasture and your herd, but also genetically speaking, and also because so the parasite piece was really important to us, but also because we wanted to move to being all forage based, all grass fed. We really wanted to work on improving rate of gains on forage only. So because of that, then we've started to incorporate Kiko into our herd. My goal is to really have that hybrid between the two, so we can continue to have the meat structure for the boar, but in the marketability, but also have the hardiness of the Kiko goat. But so that's kind of how our herd has evolved over the years.
So you have a combination of the breeds. When you're looking at bucks, are you just buying Kiko bucks now? Are you raising your own bucks, or are you still bringing in some boar genetics?
Yeah, so we have one boar buck that we alternate breeding with, but most of where we've invested our time and money, and probably more of our breeding, has been with our two Kiko bucks. And so we purchased those. I never said I would drive far away to buy livestock, and well, guess what? I did. But you look at it's since we already had a herd of does, the easiest way to expand what we were doing and add genetic diversity is obviously through the herd sires. So we ended up purchasing two Kiko bucks from McGuire Family Farms in Indiana. I really wanted to find, I didn't want to drive too far, but we drove far enough, but finding goats that sourcing animals from a farm who has similar management practices, I learned that was really the important piece. And a number of their lines have come from goats that have tested in some of the different university pasture management tests. So that was important to us. We've had them in our herd now for probably about 3 years. As we move forward, I would love to find another boar buck to work with, just so I can kind of continue to add to my herd, especially like with our younger generation of animals who are more predominantly Kiko. But I struggle to find maybe the right fit for the right genetics from the boar goats that do well on forage, or hay alone. A lot of, in our area, boar goats have become more of show 4-H animal projects, and that's fine, but it's not really the right fit for what we're doing with our farm. So I need to find, that's kind of on my wish list, find a boar buck that it does well on pasture, which I think is might be a big wish list, but someday I'll find it. But I've also contemplated on retaining back a buck kid or two to see how we maybe could that have more boar characteristics that we could maybe look at utilizing for line breeding. But at this point, as our herd is growing, I don't think we're quite there yet, and I have more demand for our meat that it just makes sense to keep growing from within with our does and look for other options, and maybe down the road we can look at doing that as well.
I think there's a real market for some boar goats that do really well on grass. I know they're out there, but as you mentioned, most of the people in my area with boar goats are raising them for show, and that's an entirely different management than I'm doing. So yes, I get that, and I struggled with some of the boars I had originally purchased because I didn't pay attention to that management piece. If they're managed, or I'm going to use the word pampered, in some of those cases they are. I'm not saying that for everyone, so I don't want a whole bunch of emails sent to me about boar goats. But some are, and I purchased some that had been, and I was doing a very non-pampered system, so it didn't work out good for me.
Yeah, and it's kind of been the tough part of how the learning curve and building our herd. I was hoping I'd be a lot farther along in my herd size and our growth, but it's taken time. I mean, I'm glad I'm where I'm at because I've learned a lot and have really focused on what makes sense for us in terms of making sure, being really focused on calling out poor performers and looking at genetics and building within. But it's but because of where I started, which I don't know how much more I could have changed, just given that I probably wouldn't have gone very too far away to source animals. It's just it's where I'm asking a lot more of my goats than maybe others are and not that if someone wants to feed grain, that's fine, but I think there's you can support an animal a lot more with that supplemental feed than having them kind of provide for themselves with being fed just forage. So it's been a long path, but a good one. The journey is probably a good way to put it.
Now, you mentioned earlier about your interior fences, and we really didn't talk about your interior fences yet. So tell us a little bit more about your interior fences.
Sure. So we have our pastures, our three main pastures kind of border around our farm property or our main, like where our farmhouse is at in our building. So it's kind of like a C. And to be able to kind of do a full rotation, depending on the groups we have, we subdivide our two pastures that flank like the house and the barns and things like that with, I have just poly wire down the center, two strands of it on step-in posts. And that kind of acts as to divide it, so that way when I run a group through, we can kind of do like a circle, kind of a full rotation of it without getting to the end and then having to, it just works well for animal flow to then go back out the same gate that we came, because there's not a gate connecting the one end. So we subdivide in the center with that's those step-in posts. We didn't always do that. We had just made L's with our portable fencing, but I found that using the poly wire at the step-in posts and a couple permanent fence posts have been really helpful for just streamlining moves. I do have to be a little bit more attentive to cleaning out or cut or trimming the grass along there, because that tends to be opportunity for grounding out more, just with having the strands there. But then we subdivide everything else, so that stays there for the summer. I usually will do some maintenance on it after winter, because with my dogs running loose, sometimes or the deer, there's some damage to the fence, so I have to fix that up. But then to subdivide our paddocks, we're using Gallagher's Smart Fence, so it's all like 4 reels in one system with fence posts built in, and we'll just build the two sides with that fence, and then then build the next paddock with another fence and just move them through. It works pretty slick just because it's an all-in-one system. I probably, our goats, like, because they trust the hot wire, they work pretty well with the hot wire in the center, the poly wire, the 2 strands. I probably could get away with less. I don't think they would. I don't trust them enough with like 1 wire, but that system, that 4 strand system, works pretty well. We had started off using electronet fence, which worked fine, but it just got to be, at one time we were grazing 3 different groups, and it just got to be too cumbersome for moving groups every few days. Now we're grazing 2 groups. At one point we were grazing a group of dairy buck kids. So we have a lot of dairy goat farms in our area, so we were also feeding out male dairy goats for meat, and so we had separate groups. But it just got to be too much using that fence. So the Gallagher fence has been a great option. We do, when we graze outside of our pasture, I will use the electronet fence. It's funny because I sold it when I got the Gallagher fence, but now that I want to graze outside of our perimeter fence, I'm back using electronet fence. But out there without a perimeter fence, I feel a lot more comfortable keeping our dogs in, our goats in, and then also keeping the wildlife kind of at bay. So we will use that to graze in our woods. And then this year, I will also do a grazing pass through our hay fields as well with that fencing.
Now your Gallagher Smart Fence, do you have multiple deals of it? Not the right word wouldn't be reels, multiple.
I call it a reel, even though there's 4 reels in one. Yeah, we have. I think I have like 9 or 10 rolls of it.
I suspected you had multiple ones. I purchased one. I used it a little while, but at the time I was fairly early in my electric fence journey, and I don't think I had my fence quite grounded good enough, because an electric fence for me had to be really hot to keep goats in.
Yeah, and I found with our goats that we have to fence train them every season. The older does, that have been around will remember, but we usually do a series of fence training to help them remember, or the new kids learn how the electric fence works. I guess it's probably the best way to say it, because we've run into issues where we've gotten some of our like feeder goats, and we've or thought, we'll just put them out, and then of course they bust through, and in the perimeter fence is not a big deal, but it takes them a little while to learn. So if we do the training up front in the spring, and I usually will do that over a series of days, it also helps them get adjusted from dry hay, to fresh pasture too. It seems to make a big difference for keeping them in the perimeter, or in the perimeter fence usually is an issue, but inside the paddock fencing, and then of course keeping it hot, keeping the minimizing any opportunity for grounding out. We also found too that we needed a stronger energizer, because we were running so many compared to when we were initially planning for sizing our energizer. We have small acreage, but we also are running way more poly wire than like a beef operation where you have a beef grazer where you've got one strand. I'm running 4 strands, and at the time it was 3 groups. It's draws a lot, so that's making some of those changes, and doing the fence training has helped a lot with the goats, and making sure they have enough to eat. So
Now, what size of energizer are you running now?
So we are using we have one energizer that runs all the electricity for all of our fencing on the farm, and so we have an M1500 Gallagher, so it has up to 15 stored joules. And when we're running it, it's somewhere probably around like 7 to 8 typically is if I run the tester. So we make sure it's always on. We can't cheat and just have the fence up, and they figure it out pretty fast. So that part is pretty important. And then also, like, our dogs respect it too, but they also are ones that, as much as they love their goat herd, if they have a chance to, like, run off just for fun, because they can, they will do that. So I always want to make sure that they stay where they need to be too.
Yes, I don't blame you for doing that. Now, you mentioned you train your goats to the fence each year. Tell us a little bit more about that process.
Yeah, so what I'll do is we will, once we're getting close to getting out on pasture, I will set up a small fence from the walkway that goes from the barn out to the pasture, and I'll just make a little loop big enough that once all the goats come out, chances are they're going to be so into with eating the grass that they probably will bump noses on the fence. And so I will usually I'll bring a lawn chair too and my crook, and I'll just watch.
Yes.
And try to keep track more of the younger goats. The older goats I'm not as concerned about.
Yes.
And typically I'll watch to see who gets, a little zap. It doesn't hurt them. Of course, people are listening, they know that if they're grazers, but it doesn't hurt them.
Right.
But it definitely gets their attention about where they're not supposed to go. And so I keep track of who gets zapped, and then watch for anybody who, when they're testing it, if they jump out, I'll help them get back in. So we'll do that for maybe an hour or two, and then I'll close up the gate to the pasture. Part of it is also, again, getting their rumen acclimated. The next day I'll do a little bit longer period, and then the following day again. And once it seems like they all have experienced the joy of the electric fence,
Yes.
then we're pretty ready to go to move out on pasture. And usually the kids will follow the lead of their moms, but it's good for them to be aware of that too. And then once we're out on pasture, I usually will make sure I'm checking the herd at least twice a day, just to make sure if a kid gets out, they can get back in. Usually because they're little enough, they can get through it, but once in a while they can't. And since they're still nursing, I want to just make sure that, there's no issue of somebody left behind. But then after, a week or two, they usually all have gotten a pretty good feel of, or remember the routine of grazing. So, but it makes a big difference, because if goats haven't been done, experienced the electric fence, then it's, they'll bust through, or they'll be more likely to peruse through it. So it's kind of an important step that we take, but it seems to work well for us.
So can you tell us a little bit more about your feeder kit interval?
Sure. So we're doing this to help have more inventory of meat, since a lot of our kids that we're growing right now are being retained to help build our herd, and we're still growing. So we're sourcing, because we're grazing and we're pasture based, we have to be a little bit choosy or picky about in terms of how we're sourcing our goats. And so there's a couple of farms in our area that do have similar management practices, not quite the same, but fairly similar, where they're utilizing pasture in their management systems, or they're even doing some brush management work. And so we've worked with them to purchase market kids to feed out on our farm. So it kind of depends. It typically on the situation with the farm, but we've in most situations we are purchasing them after weaning, and we will then bring them to our farm. We'll get them we'll put them in a pen in the barn, feed hay, kind of monitor to make sure adjustments, kind of that transition of moving to a new location kind of works. Everything kind of looks good and in check. There's no health issues. And then we will do our fence training. Usually we'll do our fence training. Sometimes my husband gets excited and wants just to move them out, so we don't have anybody in the barn, and I'm like, oh, we need to fence train, or then we have problems like we talked
Yes.
about before. But so we'll do fence training, and then we'll move them out on pasture. And we have grazed them in a separate group in the past. Now we are just merging them with our with our weaned market kids, or in the past we've put them with our weaned market kids. This year I think we're going to let our own market kids self wean with our does, so we'll just graze them with our breeding bucks. In the perfect world, I'd like to have them separate from our breeding stock just for biosecurity purposes and herd health, but it's, I'm running the farm 95% of the time on my own. And that's the way it is. And I have 2 small kids, so we kind of have to make choices on, time and how much I can do with grazing groups and so forth like that, and what we have for land utilization. Because I also don't want to have my bucks just sitting in the barn either. So we'll graze them with our breeding bucks, and then so we'll finish them usually about sometime around like January, February. And so part of the reason we finish them a little bit later is just because of accessibility to processing facilities in our area. Everybody seems to be, especially if they're pasture based, wanting to harvest in the fall. And so we've just found it, prior even to COVID, hard to get in to our processors, especially USDA. So we've just bumped back our processing dates to be in January and February when we start our first round of processing. And it actually has worked well for us because we're trying to harvest our animals a little bit at heavier weights than what we might see like in our regional livestock markets, which kind of tend to be the trends somewhere between 50 to 70 pounds for market kids. We're trying to get to about somewhere between 80 to about like around 80 pounds. I'd love to get our market goats to 90 if we could. Part of it is to it's kind of a multiple piece on that. One is that even though the livestock markets show that demand is for smaller goats, we found with our direct market, this is kind of diving into the direct market side of things, people still, even though they're buying goat meat from us and goats are smaller, they still are expecting larger cuts of meat. Even a whole goat, if you compare it to a lamb, is still like substantially smaller than a lamb. And so we're just looking at how can we still maintain the meat quality, but also maximize, get a little bit more meat yield per carcass, not only for quality, quantity and size of cuts for our customers, but also to really maximize that processing fee, because the fee for processing goats is really is pretty pricey per pound. So if we have a carcass size that's a little bit larger, that can really help us in a number of ways for maximizing our expenses, but also then the expectation of customers as well. So that's typically how we work with that feeder program. We do one of the farms that we've sourced goats from that is utilized with a brush management grazing program. We've purchased from them late season, and we've moved them in with our herd and then continue to graze them and then finish them with the rest of our goats. Ideally, we want to be bringing them in after weaning and having them have more time, spent on pasture here. But we kind of are working with our options, best with the options we have available for sourcing goats that are managed similarly to us. Because a lot of our demand is based in, as we kind of get into marketing later too, is really based in a lot of our customers are interested in grass-fed meats and the local foods avenue. So we really have to keep to that core because of our customer base, but also because it reflects like how we're managing our goats. We can't really it'd be challenging to take in feeder goats that are from genetics that are raised in a more say confinement practice.
Leslie, before we move on to our overgrazing section and discuss more into your marketing, 2 questions first. What are some challenges you've had in your journey thus far?
Yeah, I think challenges would be with raising goats on pasture, really, and it's true, I think, of other small ruminants, is really managing our herd for parasites, for parasite management, both in management practices and how we graze, and also continuing to build a hardier herd just genetically and also specifically tailored for our environment, our unique needs for where we're located. And then also, I think just being able to, it's kind of tied to that, but also not growing as fast as I was anticipating with my plans. It's just taken more time. But I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that there's not a lot of farms who are grazing goats. And so I'm kind of taking the approach of, I knew what I needed, what I was going to do, but utilizing goats in this type of management practice is not as common. And so it's, I'm kind of working on, it's taken more time just to work with what I have to get to where I'm going. So, but.
True. You point out a very real lack of resources about grazing goats. Yes.
Mm-hmm. And I'd say, and as you mentioned that, I think the other piece too with goats, even beyond just lack of resources with grazing, it's in general with goats, there's not a lot of resources at all. Usually they get lumped in with sheep, which they're similar to some degree, but from anything from university research to how much veterinarians study them in school to industry products that are focused on them that are also tailored to being lifestyle, as I do air quotes that people can't see, lifestyle animals. It's great that you have a goat product, but I'm also not gonna, I have a business I'm running too, so I can't pay a ton of money for it either.
Oh yes. Yeah.
But so that's another piece with raising goats too, has been a challenge, but you kind of learn as you go and learn from others and keep doing what you're doing. So
Right. I just on my journey growing up with cattle, we had a few goats. When I expanded and had a real herd of goats or flock of goats, I'm sure there's another term for goats and I don't even know what it is.
mm-hmm.
There's a real learning curve there.
Mm-hmm.
They're not little cattle. They're not sheep. My sheep had their own learning curve. Or maybe I'm a slow learner, but there was a very real learning curve there to get you just up to speed and going. So
Mm-hmm.
it takes longer than what you think it will.
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm.
And coupled with your challenges, but kind of the opposite end, where do you see yourself going in the future?
Yeah. So the herd itself, my plans, we'll see how it probably might take longer than I'm anticipating based on how long I've gotten to where I'm at now. But I'm hoping in probably about 5 years, I'm at the herd size that I'd like to be at, somewhere about 60 to 70 head of goats, where we're direct marketing most of those. And that's really the main focus of where I want to continue to grow our direct to consumer business too, for selling our goat meat. A lot of what we've sold in the past and up until now has been predominantly wholesale accounts, which have worked well. But with the onset of COVID, we kind of, it worked out, but we had to kind of shift on how we were marketing our meat, just because of restaurants shut down and restaurants, understandably so, not knowing what their, buying trends were going to be. And we're obviously a specialty product. So we're probably, the first on the chopping block for making decisions on versus maybe some more traditional forms of protein too. So, but,
True.
But yeah, that's the direction, is continuing to expand into our direct to consumer market and get that, our herd, have our herd grow. Some other things on our farm, I want to continue to renovate our silvopasture, or our area with our oak savanna, so we can utilize that as pasture. That's going to take quite a bit of time. I've also contemplated thinking about like how we can continue to utilize more of our goats themselves. So we sell quite a bit of organ meat, but are there other things we can do in terms of utilizing their hides, after they're harvested, some of those things. And so those are pieces that I think, as we as I continue, down the road, looking at how does that play a role in how we're, utilizing the whole animal and also maximizing, opportunity with those animals too, because a lot of, especially with goats, I mean, I know it's true with other species too, but especially with goats, a lot of that is just waste. So
Very good. And that segues right into our overgrazing section where we take a deep dive into one of your practices.
mm-hmm.
And we're going to talk more about your marketing to consumers
Mm-hmm.
for goat meat, because at least in my area, goat meat is not traditionally consumed. And it's a little bit, or for my area, it'd be a harder sell than if I was selling lamb or beef. Can you tell us some about your marketing and how it's going for you?
Sure. So our market, we are, I'm fortunate that we are close to a major metro area that's pretty diverse in itself, with folks from different cultural backgrounds. But what's been interesting is that, most, and I, as I looked into goats, part of it is with the changing cultural demographics, but a lot of people assume that most of our market is in the cultural market, and which is true. There is a good percentage of our customer base that falls into, I guess, is categorized in that market. But that market itself is so diverse, it's hard to, focus in on that unless you're looking at maybe certain specific demographics, which, can be challenging. But what we found is actually, as we've continued to grow and get involved in our community, is that the area that's really have taken off for us is the local foods market and folks who are just interested in supporting local farms and grass-fed meats from the wellness side of things. Typically, those folks are, not all of them, but they may consider themselves to be foodies. I mean, I use that word in a friendly term. I consider myself a foodie too. They love good food. The food's an experience. It's about trying new cuisines and new dishes and new types of food. And that's really where we've seen an area of growth. And it kind of started gradually, and we've seen a lot of growth in that area. And what's interesting is that, there's obviously some overlap in the two groups. But so we've really focused on trying to kind of target and serve both of those markets, but we continue to see a lot of growth in the local food space. And part of it is I found that, even if they grew up eating goat meat, or maybe grandma made it for a special occasion, they don't know how to cook it. Or not everybody, I mean, I'm generalizing, but a lot of people don't feel comfortable with cooking. And then it's also a bigger investment than even, buying beef or lamb, just because the cost per pound typically is higher than other proteins. And so a lot of folks can be intimidated by it. So I found, whether it's in either market that we serve, that I've had to learn how to cook and prepare the meat myself. I've kind of serve as a part of my education or marketing is really taken a values approach and an education approach of helping our customers learn how to cook and use goat meat, share different recipes of different ways to experience goat meat, because sometimes I think people also have different impressions of what goat meat is or how it should taste, and it can actually take on different life of its own depending on how you prepare it and what type of cultural cuisines that you're using. And so a big part of our marketing has really been focused on customer education, or helping them learn different ways to cook it and inspire them to utilize the protein in different ways. And so as you look, even like on our website, we're continuing to build out opportunities with different recipes and different ways to cook goat meat. And that's really has helped a lot with serving our customers, but also building our customer base as well.
I think you touch on a excellent point there, at least for me. How do you cook goat?
Mm-hmm.
And I notice on your website you have recipes. Do you do other educational things for cooking goat, or is your website your main avenue?
Our website is the main avenue. It's kind of the central hub for where information from our farm kind of starts. And I'd like to do more on recipes and other guides and so forth. It's just a matter of where
time
I get
issue.
time, but I've got to be out,
Yes.
in the goat barn or out in the pasture and so forth. But
Oh, yes.
a lot of that information is housed on our website, but then I will be, but then it works off of a lot of our other marketing platforms. So, we do have, like, when we pack orders, a lot of our recipes, we have printed out in recipe cards. So we will always send a recipe card with, based on cuts that people order. If somebody is a more regular customer, I don't always send recipe cards because I
Oh, yeah.
figure they probably have a good idea of what they're doing at this point too. But we'll use that, in the print form, but then also in our email newsletter, that our email marketing that we send out twice a month that corresponds with order deadlines. We'll usually have a recipe that's featured, and so that ties back. It's connected back to our website in that regard. We'll utilize those on social media with Instagram and Facebook as well too. So I like to get kind of multi-purpose a lot of our content on our website and other areas to share that. But we're always looking for new ways to, help share and inspire folks to want to try goat meat or consume it more. And we've also looked at ways too, from a marketing perspective, of folks who are looking to eat goat meat more regular, who have maybe had it in their more commonly, in their diet, or at least have access to it in the past. We do sell some whole goats. People are still more comfortable buying cuts of meat versus a large quantity of meat, even though a whole goat is only maybe like 30 pounds of meat, which isn't a lot when you compare it to, like, if you bought like a half a beef or a whole beef,
Oh, yes.
a side of beef. But I found that we've looked for ways to, how can we manage our inventory, because we have freezer storage on the farm with our inspected meat. And so we're looking at, how can we serve customers who want to buy a whole goat, because traditionally, that's how they've been able to purchase a goat, and they want to look for more value in buying in bulk. So we've also added options for purchasing, like bulk boxes. So it's not the same as buying a whole goat, but in a lot of times it still meets that need, because it's, those bulk boxes are more focused on our ground and our stew meat, which are pretty versatile cuts that, if you're eating goat meat more frequently, those are more common cuts to be incorporated into your, regular menu planning. Not that folks don't enjoy, goat chops or shanks and so forth, but we've tried to adapt our marketing and having supply in hand and the piece of how often we're harvesting to try to have goat meat more frequently. So part of that is, how do we look at how we package options for our customers to, either if they fit into the area of wanting to try, new types of proteins and new different dishes, the food experience, to having goat meat be, just more frequent in their normal, kitchen list of, kitchen staples and items that they can pick from their freezer. So those have been really kind of our main approach. I'd say our main approaches. A lot of our marketing, though, is really driven in the digital space of utilizing, it all comes back to our website, but utilizing our email marketing platform, and then utilizing social media to help drive people to our email list, so we can continue to grow our prospective customer base. That's been really critical for us for our growth. We still, even though we ship most of our direct to consumer meat, we also do have on-farm pickup option for our local customer, our customers in our local area, to give them access without necessarily needing to have something be mailed to them.
Oh, yes. Now, you mentioned your email list. How do you utilize your email list?
So we have, we ship twice a month. So we have order deadlines on our website for that correspond with those ship dates. And so I send an email out about 3 to 5 days before that order deadline. And typically, so it kind of corresponds nicely, because then if we have a special or something, then it's all tied into that email. But the email,
Oh,
I
yeah.
really try to provide value in the email. So part of it, there's an update from the farm. There's typically a recipe or something that's cooking focused. There may be something that's tied to some relevant news or information that's tied to our farm. So, for example, I probably will link to this podcast, or if we've been featured in the newspaper or other things.
Oh, yes.
If there's some fun, I try to push content back to our website just because that helps with web traffic and continuing that to have our customers work with us versus going to social. But sometimes there's always like new fun things that you can do on Instagram. So every once in a while,
Oh, yes.
I'll send them over to Instagram for something fun that I did. But I really try to, we have sales in there, but I try to make it more than just sales because I see this really as being a relationship tool and adding value for our customers. And then, but then we typically have some type of special that's in there. And a lot of times I try to coordinate it with what the recipe is. That is not always the case, but then we have, then we'll have our order deadlines on there for shipping and for farm pickup as well too. Because I also want to be clear that, if they want to order that they can,
Oh, yes.
and make that ask for that sale. But, so it's kind of a mix. And sometimes, during the year we may have a lull in inventory, but I'll still do a communication at least once a month to kind of stay in touch with our customers. Cause I really see it as, in the digital space, email marketing and even being on social they're just continual touch points to continue to build relationships and transparency with your customers. It's really important. I think it's also what really sets us apart as direct market farmers is that, somebody else could be raising and selling goats or another business could be selling goat meat, but it's part of the package of branding is who we are as farmers, and our story is part of, we make that connection with our customers. And so that's built into our marketing. But that's how our email marketing traditionally works that way. I talk a lot too.
Very good. You have provided wonderful information. I'm enjoying this conversation so much, but it is time we move on to our famous four. Our famous four are the same questions we ask of all of our guests, and I'm pretty sure they're famous, but if they're not, they will be famous soon. So, what's your favorite grazing grass related book or resource?
My favorite book is Dirt to Soil by Gabe Brown. I really like the book. In a variety of fashions I heard him speak in an all-day program, which is basically, it was like his book in presentation form.
Yes.
But, he just has a great delivery method of talking about how he transitioned his farm over time. But I also, as a grazer and someone who's in regenerative agriculture that is in the northern kind of tier of climate in our country, I also really I found his practices and some of his approaches to be really intriguing in terms of like I listened to it audio wise, but then I bought the book after and started to make notes in it because ultimately I'd like to, and I have some more time again, which I need to carve it out. But I think there's a lot of takeaways that I could, even though he's totally different type of farm or ranch than what we're doing. I think there's a lot of things that I could apply to what we're doing on our farm just from the sheer fact of, similar climate and things in that regard. So, and that's one of my favorite grazing resources.
Very good. Our second question, what tool could you not live without on your farm?
I'd say probably my shepherd's crook.
Oh, yes. That's the first time that's been the answer for the favorite tool on the farm. But I totally get it. But go ahead and tell us about it.
Yeah. So we have, I'd probably call it like a modernized shepherd's crook. I have a Kiwi crook. And so it was, I think, based out of, I think New Zealand is, of course, you probably get feedback from people who listen. I believe Kiwis are from New Zealand, if I'm remembering the right area. And it's a fiberglass crook with like a plastic. Of course, I'm using my hands, but nobody else is going to see. But it's a traditional crook if you think of the the curved top that's kind of, that on the top, but then it also has a little tool on the other end that's good for grabbing legs. And it's just a great animal handling tool because goats are fast. And if I can reduce kind of doing goat rodeo, I kind of point it that way.
Yes.
Especially in the pasture when it's harder to, like, if there's a goat that I wanted to get a closer look at, that I might be concerned about something, or check on a kid, that crook can help me grab the animal fast and quick in a safe manner that causes not a lot of stress, versus if I didn't have it, I'd be doing a lot of chasing. It's harder, in an electric paddock to try to corner them. So like it helps me accomplish that task a lot faster. And once goats know that you want to get a hold of them, that one particular goat, they know, and then there's a lot harder to get a hold of them. So this kind of makes that tool. This tool works really well, and I highly recommend this particular crook. So we have we also actually have two of them. We have a his and a hers. So when we get to do major animal handling, my husband and I both have our own crook. So
very good. And you don't let him use yours, right?
Well, we don't have them labeled, so they're kind of interchangeable. So.
Oh yeah. What do you know now that you wish you knew when you started this journey?
I would say be patient and know that with grazing livestock, there's so many factors that come into play with your goals of raising livestock that a lot of them are out of your control and that you have to work with. Mother Nature throws a lot more at you as a grazer in terms of working within the environment. Even just that you think of like the environment as like the ecosystem around you and how you're managing your farm. And so it takes time to learn the practice of grazing. And I've talked a little bit about this before too, but also continuing to grow your herd for your farming operation. Not every, especially with goats, not all goats are cut out to be grazers. And even goats that, may have been in similar, every farm is a little bit different. And so it's having patience to know that there'll be learning curves and it'll take time to get to where you want to go, but it's not a cut and fast path like it might be if you're, have a lot more control over all the external factors, but you'll get there, but you just need to have patience. And in the long run, it's a long game. I think it's a good path, but it's, patience is key. It's not an overnight process for becoming, a grazer and being happy with your herd and your system and so forth. It takes time.
Excellent advice. Where can others find out more about you?
Sure. A lot of our information about our farm, and I have a blog with a lot of information about how we're raising our goats, and also on the meat sale side of things, is on our website, cylonrollingacres.com. And so that's kind of all things. Our farm is there. I have an email list also for folks who are interested in learning about how we raise our goats on pasture. I do kind of an update on what's going on in the farm, more on the farming side of things versus like what we do with our customers. And then I'm also on social media with Facebook and Instagram at our handle of our farm, Cylon Rolling Acres. I'm more active on Instagram just because there's a lot more. I think it lends well for what we do in agriculture with visually speaking and what we're doing. So, but definitely those are places where folks can find me.
Very good. We will post links to that in our show notes. Mm-hmm. Leslie, we really appreciate you coming on and sharing with us today.
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity.
Again, we want to thank Leslie for coming on to the podcast. Greatly appreciate her sharing about her experience with meat goats. You're listening to the Grazing Grass Podcast, helping grass farmers learn from grass farmers. And as always, we appreciate you listening and encourage you to share this episode with someone who might find it valuable. Also, leave a comment, review, any or all of the above. And as always, keep on grazing. Hey there, listeners. We appreciate you tuning in and want to continue bringing you the best content we can. But producing a podcast takes a lot of time and effort, so we need your support. You can help us out by joining the Grazing Grass community and becoming a supporter for exclusive content and early releases. Also, you can buy our merch to show your love for the show, or by using our affiliate links to purchase products or services we recommend. If you can't support us financially, please spread the word and tell others about our show. Thank you for your support, and we can't wait to bring you more great conversations from grass farmers like you.